Hi and welcome to the African Cinema Podcast. This is your host Tendai, and today, after a bit of a break, we are taking a deep dive into the history of South African cinema. Now, this will be a 3-part series, and for the first episode, we'll be looking at the period between 1895 and 1948. As per the usual, I have tried my best to be as accurate as possible in this research. So if you do end up spotting a mistake, or if there's any errors basically in dates or anything else, feel free to reach out and I will get it updated. Now, South African cinema began almost as soon as the technology was invented. The Edison kinetoscope opened in Johannesburg in 1895, and by 1896, the first film projections were shown to local audiences. Carl Hertz brought out a projector from England and screened the first production at the Empire Palace of Varieties in Commissioner Street, Johannesburg, on 11 May 1896. The press at this point was very ecstatic. Hertz had introduced South Africa to the era of the Bioscope through a series of 30-second films. By 1898, the Empire Palace of Varieties in Commissioner Street adopted film as a permanent part of its program. These films, which were taken by Edgar Hyman, who had earlier accompanied Carl Hertz on his tour, were purchased from the Warwick Trading Company. They consisted mostly of views of Johannesburg taken from the front of a tram. Another of Hyman's films showed the president of the Transvaal Republic of that time, Paul Kruger, leaving his house for the Radzal. By October 14, 1899, 3 days after the declaration of the start of the Anglo-Boer War, W.K. Dixon, who had perfected the motion picture camera and had also worked with Edison on it, set out for South Africa to record the war on film. The use of film as a new medium for propaganda was discovered and exploited during this war. This would be a very recurring theme across all episodes. As film developed, the first film on sport was screened at the Tivoli Music Hall in Cape Town in 1906. The sport was a cricket match between England and South Africa, which was shot by an amateur cameraman. Now, skip forward to the Union era. This is between 1910 and 1948. The local industry remained colonial and white-controlled. African filmmaking was almost non-existent, while film distribution was monopolized by Schlesinger's Africa's Film Productions and later African Consolidated Theatres. However, on 11 December 1910, the first theatre for colored people was opened on the corner of Grey and Alice Streets in Durban. In the same year, The Great Kimberley Diamond Robbery was released. This was the first South African full-length feature drama film produced entirely in the country. This movie, with a runtime of only 15 minutes, centered around Dick Grandjoy, who buys a diamond that was found near the Vaal River. He then decides to take the diamond to Cape Town or London to sell it. However, two desperados learn of the diamond and plan to rob Dick. They abduct Dick's wife, Kate, to obtain the whereabouts of the diamond. Between 1911 and 1912, two cornerstone studios were established. Africa's Amalgamated Theatres opened its doors in 1911, followed by Edgar Hyman's Empire Theatres Company in 1912. However, both these companies were bought by Austrian-Hungarian tycoon Isidore W. Schlesinger in 1913 and turned into the African Consolidated Theatres. The ACT would later dominate the film industry for the better part of the century. Schlesinger also established South Africa's first motion picture studio, African Film Productions, in 1911 in Klane, Johannesburg. With the newly formed AFP, it also started its very first studio called Kelane Film Studios in Johannesburg and found its first production in Der Voortrekkers, made in 1916. This film became a staple among the descendants of the Dutch-speaking Voortrekkers who participated in the Great Trek. They revered the film to such an extent that they used it in commemorating the event, which stands as one of the most contentious periods in South Africa's history. It is also recognized as South Africa's first feature-length film and first epic in the country's motion picture history. Between 1916 and 1921, the AFP made 43 films. These films often made use of dramatic scenery available in rural KwaZulu-Natal, particularly the Drakensberg region. KwaZulu-Natal also served as the location for most historical films. During the time period as well, a lot of international collaboration was going on, especially between the AFP and American directors, actors, and actresses. American filmmaker Lorimer Johnson directed several films in the area in the late 1910s, which starred American actresses Edna Fulgrath and Caroline Franks-Cook. Notable films from this period include, as mentioned earlier, The Voortrekkers, Alan Quatermain, made in 1919, and King Solomon's Mines, made in 1918. These were often adaptations or inspired by popular adventure and historical narratives with somewhat international recognition. These films helped position South African cinema within a broader imperial and global context, appealing to British and American audiences as well as local viewers. On the distribution end, Schlesinger controlled film distribution from the Cape to the Zambezi River, effectively linking South Africa's film industry with broader British imperial markets. This facilitated the circulation of South African films abroad and the import of foreign films into South Africa, reinforcing transnational cinematic flows. In 1921, the film Under the Lash, directed by Sam Wood and starring American actress Gloria Swanson, was screened. This was the first anti-South African film to be shown. The film is an American silent drama based on the 1906 play The Shulamite and the 1904 novel by Alice and Claude Askew. It tells the story of Deborah, the oppressed wife of a cruel and bigoted Boer farmer, who finds kindness and eventual rescue through an Englishman overseer. Under the Lash portrayed Boer society in a negative light, emphasizing themes of religious fanaticism, domestic abuse, and oppressive patriarchal authority within the Afrikaner farming communities. This depiction aligned with the broader international critique of South African rural society, particularly the Boer population. This was during the post-Boer War period when tensions between British and Afrikaner identities were still raw. By 1923, H. de Ver Stakpol's The Blue Lagoon was produced and distributed by AFP. However, given the economic turmoil of the mid-20s to the early 30s, South African cinema developed at a slower pace during this time. In August 1930, the first sound film of Black traditional life, titled In the Land of the Zulus, was screened. It was produced by African Film Productions. And by 1931, the Capitol Theatre in Pretoria opened. In the same year as well, Sari Marais, directed by Joseph Albrecht, became the first South African sound film. This 10-minute black and white film was shot in Johannesburg and featured both English and Afrikaans dialogue, marking the first use of Afrikaans in South African cinema. The film depicted Boer prisoners of war in a British camp, with one prisoner lifting his voice in the patriotic Afrikaans tune, My Sari Marais. The 1930s were more of a turning point. They marked the beginning of a decade in which Afrikaner nationalism would grow significantly through Afrikaans language films. Films such as Sari Marais and Mogdeshi heralded this development. In the 1930s, Afrikaner nationalists established film production organizations, and from the 1930s onwards, the newly created Afrikaans language cinema became an arm of propaganda from the Afrikaner nationalists. Within the same year, Schlesinger merged his interests with that of kinemas, which led to the establishment of African Consolidated Films and Theatres under the AFP banner. On the political front, the National Censorship Act of 1931 was passed by Parliament, followed by the Entertainment Act, which demanded that all cinematic material be cleared before exhibition. In all this, African Film Productions made the first sound advertisement films in South Africa for Joko Tea and Pegasus products. In 1934, the first tourist film, a serial cinema magazine titled Outland, was made by the African Film Productions. This production was significant because it showcased South Africa's diverse landscapes, cultural heritage, and tourist attractions, aiming to promote both national pride and tourism to local and international audiences. AFP's production of Our Land marked an early example of film being used to market South Africa as a desirable destination, helping to lay the groundwork for future tourism-related media and contributing to the growth of the South African film industry in the 1930s. The South African Censor Board was officially established in 1936, marking the formal institutionalization of film censorship in the country. This development followed earlier legislative groundwork, including the National Censorship Act of 1931 and the Entertainment Act, which required all cinematic material to be cleared before public exhibition. The creation of the Censor Board centralized and formalized control over film content shown in South Africa, which was a reflection of the growing government interest in regulating media to align the prevailing social and political norms of the time. The board was tasked with screening and approving films to ensure they conformed to moral, political, and cultural standards set by the government. This included the suppression of material deemed obscene, politically subversive, or offensive to the ruling white minority sensibilities. The establishment of the Censor Board was part of a broader pattern of increasing state control over cultural production, which intensified with the rise of Afrikaner nationalism and later apartheid policies. The board's activities were linked to the government's desire to use cinema as a tool for ideological socialization, promoting narratives that supported segregationist and nationalist agendas while suppressing dissenting voices. Initially, censorship focused on imported films, but over time, it extended to locally produced content, ensuring that all cinematic output adhered to the state's ideological framework. In 1938, William Boxer established the Alexander Films, recognized as South Africa's first dedicated cinema advertising company. Alexander Films specialized in producing and distributing advertising content specifically designed for cinema audiences. This included commercial advertisements and promotional shots shown before feature films, marking the beginning of a formalized cinema advertising sector in South Africa. The founding of Alexander Films reflected the growing commercial importance of cinema beyond just entertainment, recognizing its potential as a powerful medium for marketing and consumer influence. Also in 1938, filmmaker Joseph Albrecht released Die Boer van Nasie, a film commemorating the centenary of the Great Track. The film was produced in both English and Afrikaans, reflecting the bilingual nature of South African society at the time and the growing cultural assertion of the Afrikaans language. Die Boer van Nasie functioned as a piece of nationalist propaganda that reinforced Afrikaner cultural heritage and political aspirations during a period when Afrikaner nationalism was gaining momentum. In 1939, the Second World War started. This accelerated Afrikaner nationalism and motivated the movement to produce culturally specific films. This trend ushered in the 1940s, which saw Afrikaans nationalism reach new levels of intensity that were expressed in a number of Afrikaans language films. In 1940, the RARO, Reddingsbond Amateur Rolpunt Organisasie, was founded as an amateur film organization under the auspices of Reddingsbond, a prominent Afrikaner philanthropic and cultural organization. Established in 1903, the Reddingsbond was originally formed to provide financial and social assistance to impoverished Afrikaners after the devastation of the Anglo-Boer War. Over time, it expanded its role to promote Afrikaner culture, language, and economic upliftment. The formation of RARO was part of Reddingsbond's cultural initiatives to encourage Afrikaner identity and pride through the medium of film. By 1942, RARO would release its first two full-length features, Raro's productions were significant because they provided an alternative to the dominant English language and Hollywood films, fostering a local film culture that emphasized Afrikaner heritage and values. And in the following year, the Silas Hahoff Moshet Commission submitted a report recommending the establishment of a South African National Film Board. The recommendation was aimed at creating a state-supported body to oversee and promote the South African film industry, particularly to support local productions and coordinate film propaganda efforts during the World War II era. In 1947, the Carrefour Film Company was established, funded by the church. This company was part of a wave of institutional efforts to promote film production with moral and cultural objectives aligned with church values. Now, everything that happens between 1948 and 1994 will be discussed in our second episode. Now, to catch the rest of this, be sure to check back in next week on Monday when we'll have the second part. And the week after that, we'll have the third part of the South African cinema history. It's quite interesting. That's why I had to divide it into 3 parts, and it's quite long as well. And if you haven't already, do subscribe to the newsletter and follow us on LinkedIn or Facebook or Instagram as well. Just look for the African Cinema Podcast. Ciao.